Hey everyone, my name is Solomon Thomas. I'm a former Marine. I'm about to graduate with my master's in psychology, and I have the goal of becoming a clinical psychologist and professor one day. And so I'm making these YouTube videos with two intentions. One, my hope is to practice clarifying my thoughts and speaking in front of a camera, which is a good analogy for the public. And I'm also hoping that as I'm sharing these ideas that I've found interesting and engaging, that they might be of use for anyone out there who's listening. So, in this video, I wanted to talk about identity. This was a topic that was requested by one of my fraternity brothers, and so I figured I'd try to offer a paradigm that might be useful for other people. So, when I think of identity, I think of a gestalt, so the whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. I think of identity as a gestalt of biology and culture. And when biology and culture come together in an individual, they generate a pattern or a dynamic system that cannot be reduced to one or the other. So let's talk about biology and culture first and then see if I can bring them together in a way that makes sense. So first, when thinking about your identity, it can be useful to know that you're a biological creature. You're a creature of nature. And also, as a caveat, I'm going to separate biology and culture, but in reality, both interact in very complex ways and have been interacting in complex ways for millions of years, perhaps. And so it's a simplification, but in my mind, it's useful to delineate the two. So you're a biological creature. You evolved and have adapted to many different types of environments, and you can think of your nervous system and I would say your mind as a hierarchy of biological systems that have evolved to solve specific problems. And I mentioned in a previous video how you can even think of your personality as a set of these sub-personalities, a set of these different systems, such as your emotional systems, you have cognitive systems, you have different types of memory in terms of behavioral or procedural memory, and then episodic memory and semantic memory. You have all these different systems that coalesce into you as a living organism in such a manner, ideally, so that way you can live in various environments long enough to reproduce. Now, these systems require integration and harmony, and they can get out of whack. They can become pathological. Perhaps that's the point of maturity, is to work through integrating all of these different sub-personalities and sub-emotional and motivational systems that are trying to push you forward in life and are trying to help you adapt in your environment and manifest appropriate patterns of perception and behavior so that way you can live in a socially appropriate manner with other people. So you're a biological creature. You have these genes that have created nervous system structures that determine, in some instances, but perhaps more broadly speaking, influence how you see the world. They influence the kind of attention and the frequency of attention that you pay to certain things in reality and how you see certain people and how you see yourself. And so one framework for understanding largely these biological systems would be the Big Five personality paradigm. So the Big Five stands for the Big Five traits. Acronym is OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And to clarify, when I'm using this framework, personality, generally speaking, as well as things like creativity and intelligence, they do have a large genetic component to them where the hereditary rate or hereditary element ranges from 50 to 80% depending on the empirical research that you look at. So that doesn't mean that it's purely a biological phenomenon, but I'm hoping that this personality paradigm is helpful in just understanding that there's a large part of you that comes from nature that is set in a manner that you didn't really have anything to do with. And that doesn't mean that it's 100% fixed or 100% rigid. There is research stating that people can change their temperament and personality to a degree, but the point I'm trying to make is that your biology plays a major role in how you act in the world and how you perceive things. And so that's important to know. Okay, the other component of your identity that I want to talk about is culture. And again, biology and culture interact in many complicated ways, but just separating them for a second. So you're also a cultural creature. It's not just that you have these biological goals, these motivations of hunger, thirst, and you need to sleep and you need to regulate your temperature and you want to have sex. Like you have these biological goals so that way you can survive and reproduce, but you also have to solve the problem of accomplishing those goals in a manner that is socially acceptable because we are social creatures. We've evolved to be social creatures, so that's a way that biology and culture mix. And you're surrounded by other creatures who also have those same goals. There's a lot of overlap, but they also have their own individual goals. So you have to solve two problems. You have to solve the problem of achieving your biological goals as well as acting in the world in a manner that makes other people want to be around you or at least accepts you socially so that way they don't inhibit your goals or they don't inhibit your progress towards your own goals. And in my mind, that's where culture comes into play. You can think of culture as a set of social norms or a set of agreed upon rules for how we're going to play this game, right? It's not only that, well, I'm hungry because I'm a living organism and I need to eat, but it's also that I need to obtain and store and eat my food in a manner that doesn't get in your way of trying to accomplish that same goal. And so, given an environment where there's limited resources, now we have to compete, or maybe we decide to cooperate. But either way, now we're playing a different game once you throw the fact that we aren't individual, isolated creatures living in an empty environment. There's other people, and so we have to take that into account. And over years, over millions of years of animals trying to work through optimal ways of organizing ourselves, what emerge are norms and rules that, at least in the human example, can become codified into rituals and traditions and philosophies and ethics. And now we can elucidate and articulate these cultural norms and say things like, you should be a good sport, or no one likes a sore loser, or it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. We have all these memes, you can use that term, that are essentially compressed information that are related to ways of behaving, patterns of behavior. And these cultural norms exist in part because they've enabled optimal communication and optimal cooperation and competition in such a manner so that way you can accomplish your goals and I can accomplish my goals. And maybe if we're lucky, we can make more resources or generate a society where more people can play the game and life just continues to flourish. And so that's the aim, right? But hopefully that's a useful explanation of culture and how you are a biological creature that has these proclivities and you're born with certain set points in terms of your ability and the way that you perceive the world, but that all has to match in a socially appropriate manner such that you can accomplish your goals and everyone else can. So when it comes back to identity, I like to think of identity as the coalescing of these two forces. You have your unique personality, you have your temperament that's relatively set from birth, but you are being raised in a social environment where there are already cultural norms and traditions and rituals that people abide by. And so if you want to learn, if you want to be able to get food, if you want to be able to play with other people, you have to reconcile and balance and harmonize between your idiosyncrasies, your biological idiosyncrasies, and the demands and expectations of society. And I like to think of your identity as a unique musical piece because there's variation between individuals. There's biological variation, but we could say there's other forms of variation that I can't really categorize right now. But you have different personalities. People have different personalities. And part of the reason, from my understanding, that people have different personalities is because it's not obvious in terms of what is the best way for an individual or for groups to act given the anomalous nature of the future. So, for example, one personality trait is conscientiousness, and people who are highly conscientious are orderly and they're industrious, they're diligent, they keep their promises, they like order and they like predictable things. Personality is distributed throughout the population on a normal distribution. And so you have people at an average, and then you have people at the extremes in terms of the rate or levels of conscientiousness. So you have some people who really like order, and you have some people who really don't like order. And part of the reason that personality has been set up that way through nature is because sometimes you do need to be orderly and sometimes you don't need to be orderly. Sometimes you need more spontaneity and you need more unpredictability and you need like creative, innovative flow, and you need to erase the boundaries that you've set either physically, say like in your workspace, for example, or on your laptop, or in your mind. You need to rethink how you look at the world, which means you have to get rid of the strict categorical boundaries that you've created in your mind. You have to break those stereotypical norms that you use to perceive the world. So that's just an example of how part of the reason that there are individual differences is because it's not obvious in terms of what is the best way to move forward all of the time. And so at a species level perspective, if there's wide variation in potential solutions and potential interpretations of the world, that means that some people will be right some of the time and some people will be wrong. But again, at a species level, at least we'll have some people that are right. So given those individual differences in biological proclivities, that can come to be tempered and integrated into cultural norms. And ideally, if it's done properly, from my understanding, you get individuals who can play well with other people while also voicing their unique perspective on the world. Because not only do individuals, this goes going back to identity, not only do individuals have their unique biological proclivities, but in a very real sense, individuals will also have their own unique experience in their biological and cultural environment. So by the time you're an adult, you've amassed an amount of experience that no one else has, relatively speaking. In a literal sense, no one has been where you've been, or thought what you thought, or stood where you stood. And so, to a very real degree, you have a unique perspective, and that means that sometimes you're going to see things that no one else will see, and maybe most of the time you're going to be wrong, which is why a good proportion of the time it's useful to adhere to the norms of your culture. But there will be times where the norm is incorrect. The norm is outdated. The norm, if adhered to by more and more people, will actually lead to the destruction of a society, we should say. So both instances are needed. There are times where you have to subject yourself to cultural norms, and there are times where you have to be able to stand outside of the culture to analyze it and update it and bring your idiosyncratic experience to the table, again, ideally in a socially acceptable way, to convince people that they're going down the wrong path and maybe there's an alternate solution here, or here's a different interpretation on reality that maybe, if embodied, will be better for not only yourself but those around you. So to try to relate all of that back to identity, your identity is not reducible to your culture. It's not reducible to one dimension of what makes you who you are. It's not reducible to one personality trait like your intelligence or your creativity or your extrovertedness. It's not reducible to your race. It's not reducible to your sex. It's not reducible to your religious affiliation, because all of those things are the different instruments that make up the beautiful orchestra that is you. Your identity is something more like the conductor, and not just the conductor, but the relationship between the conductor and all of the important instruments and sections that make up the musical piece. You're the whole thing, and you aren't reducible to any of the one components. And I think that's something in our current culture that we're wrestling with. We struggle to see ourselves as more than what meets the eye, to use the cliche. We struggle to see ourselves as more than our biological proclivities, our lust, for example, or we struggle to see ourselves as more than our race or our sex or our level of intelligence. And to some degree, you can understand that because those are very powerful forces, and there is some truth and utility in identifying yourself with a group or with a trait, because it's simple, and these things manifested to a large degree for a reason, because they're useful and we can understand them. But I think a better way to think of your identity is, like I said, as the gestalt, as the whole that is more than the sum of the parts, as a product of millions of years of evolution from a biological perspective, but also as the dynamic biological organism that has the potential to integrate itself into a society, so that way the individual and the group can potentially adapt and live and flourish. Gonna end the video there. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.